This is a Chinese monster for high-speed construction. The machine lifts a concrete beam weighing 1,000 tons. It stretches from one bridge support to another for 40 meters and installs it by itself. They build bridges so quickly in China. The trains will zoom over it right above the sea at a speed of 350 kilometers per hour for the first time on the planet. Moreover, they mastered constructing skyscrapers in 90 days, hospitals in 10 days, and residential houses in just a day. They've laid high-speed railways from scratch more than the entire world combined. Stadiums, tunnels under the sea, 100-kilometer-long bridge. Stop! Everything I just listed can be summed up in a single second. How did China transform from a poor village into the world's leading builder and investor? And why is this just the beginning? Do you know what unites the headquarters of the African Union in Ethiopia and a seaport in Sri Lanka? Yes, these facilities were built by the Chinese. But to grasp the real scale, let's take a look at the entire map of Africa. Where do you think Chinese construction is currently underway on the continent? The answer is in all countries, except for this small territory, Eswatini. They provided 5 billion to Nigeria for a massive hydroelectric power station. The largest bridge in Africa, in Mozambique, is being built with Chinese money. In 2017, a 500-kilometer railway was constructed in Kenya at a speed of over 700 meters per day. Even on the islands of Cape Verde, these small ones in the ocean, the Chinese managed to build housing, a dam, a stadium, and the building of the local farmland. In Zimbabwe, by the way, a new Chinese parliament is also in the works.
You know, Chinese they are skillful.
And now, attention. How much money does China make from construction in Africa? In 2003, it was $2 billion and $5 million. Not bad. But now it's 25 times more. Almost 50 billion consistently every year. And why China? Why in Africa? It's logical. There is little money there, but many opportunities. This is where the Chinese are testing their skills on how they will conquer the world without guns. So, what are the main advantages of Chinese construction? They do it faster than anyone, cheaper than anyone, and willing to build on credit. Now, let's look at specific examples of what faster and cheaper means. Look, there are drilling machines. Now, in China, there is a boom in tunnel construction for high-speed railways, subways, all in extreme conditions. They are drilling a straight path to Tibet inside the mountains at an altitude of several thousand meters where there is simply not enough oxygen. Or they are digging the longest underwater tunnel. With this technology, work progresses at a speed of 10 meters per day and costs only $10 million per kilometer. To give you a comparison, the same 1 kilometer tunnel in the United States will cost $50 million. So it's clear that it's cheap and fast. And why on credit? Let me explain with a specific example. In 2008, Sri Lanka ambitiously decided to invest in its own development and build a new deep water port. But they didn't have their own money. Relations with the West were not great, and in the end, the port kindly agreed to build. By whom? Correct, the Chinese. Naturally, Not for free, but with interest. However, with the development and business in the port not taking off, it turned out to be unprofitable. And then Sri Lanka has to pay over $1 billion in debt. As you remember, there is no money. But the Chinese are kind folks, willing to forgive the debt, but on the condition that Sri Lanka leases the port to them for 99 years. Well, they did build it for a reason, and in 2017, Sri Lanka agreed. So they essentially give a part of their territory, albeit a small one, to another country, China.
The port is approximately 10 nautical miles from the main trade route, positioning it in the ideal location to facilitate trade from the east to the west and vice versa.
By the way, the same thing could happen with the Kenyan port of Mombasa. This is where, you remember, the Chinese built a 500-kilometer railway in record time. Understandably, not for free, but with the same interest and rates. Only Kenya's debt is already almost $5 billion. There are legal disputes, but Kenyans seem to be saying that they don't have the money. But I think the Chinese methods are clear. As American President John Adams once said, there are two ways to conquer a nation. The first is by the sword, the second is by debt. China usually chooses the second. But how did China suddenly leap forward? And how much capacity does it still have? After all, if you remember, in the mid-20th century, everyone admired Japanese economy, technology, construction, and then everything stopped. Let's rewind time about 40, or better yet, 50 years ago. Late 1960s, the 20th century, the Soviet Union. Here, at a rapid pace, they are building standard housing, standard metro, and Chinese builders come here to consult. Pay attention, Chinese builders are consulting with the Soviet Union. They are only planning to dig a subway in Beijing, so they came here to learn. Or, as the further history will show, to take everything good. But at that time, Western filmmakers were not admiring the Chinese, but the Soviet scale of construction.
The Soviet industrial might has been turned to the biggest housing program in the history of the world.
And in principle, at that time, China was a country with nothing special. A planned economy, portraits of leaders, communist slogans. Even at home in Asia, things are going much better in Korea, as I mentioned, and in Japan. There is a real economic boom there.
The most consistently high growth rate in the world, single-figure inflation, and just 2% unemployment.
But keep an eye on the numbers. In 1980, 70% of the population already lives in cities, which is approximately 200 million people. In that same year, those 200 million Chinese in China itself also live in cities. However, the difference is that the population of China at that time is not 288 million Soviet citizens, but 1 billion. This means that 800 million out of that billion are impoverished villages. They live on less than $2 a day and work inefficiently. As people say, in your oil. So, China had an abundance of this oil, meaning very cheap labor. It just needed to figure out where to pull it from the Chinese fields and put it to work. In 1980, the new Chinese leader, Deng Xiaoping, decides to experiment. Before that, he had visited Singapore, and apparently he was shocked by how well one could live and develop there. And then comes my favorite story about how a fishing village with 30,000 residents, this time Shenzhen, turns into the Chinese Silicon Valley with 12 million people in just 40 years. How did this happen? Deng Xiaoping establishes a free economic zone for foreign companies in Shenzhen. What does China offer them? Well, first, Shenzhen will only develop with your foreign investments because we don't have money. We only have a billion pairs of hands. And to attract these foreign investments, foreigners are exempted from duties and corporate taxes. This means if there is no profit, you pay nothing. If there is profit, you can take a break for another 5 years. We'll wait. There were a bunch of additional economic discounts and incentives, but that's not the point. Second, everything produced in Shenzhen will be for export. And third, Shenzhen was not chosen by chance. Look, almost across the road there are Hong Kong and Taiwan, where the smoke from economic development rises in columns, and China successfully catches up with this smoke. Because for 40 years, Shenzhen's HDP will be growing at a rate of 20% per year, and from $40 million, it will soar to $400 billion. Wow! What do construction technologies have to do with this? Remember the story with the arrival of Chinese metro buildings in Moscow to learn. But here, you don't need to go anywhere. The Chinese ingeniously turned the tables, bringing both money and technology themselves. Well, here is a good example. In 2005, China has a problem. The distances between cities are vast, and moving quickly is not working. In short, they need high-speed trains, but they don't have them. That's a problem. What does China do? They turn to proven foreigners, but not just buying. They transfer the technology to themselves because the quote from the local leadership sounds like this: our development cannot be beneficial only to foreign economies. In 17 years, China invests a whopping $300 billion in high-speed railways. As I mentioned earlier, practically from scratch, China will create 40,000 kilometers of high-speed lines. Currently, this is more than the rest of the world combined. And, as a bonus, China will have such a variety of high-speed comrades of its own production. For example, the CRH-380 is a Chinese bullet train that reaches speeds of 350 kilometers per hour. The Chinese didn't develop it themselves, but instead, pay attention, they partnered with German Siemens and Bombardier, and also with the Japanese from Hitachi. However, it's exclusively manufactured in China. Someone who knows for sure will probably comment now. By the way, guys, don't hesitate, just spill the beans, these investments didn't pay off, and probably never will, because many railroads are still unprofitable. I won't argue. But these colossal expenditures on their own infrastructure have triggered such instant developments in their own technologies that they have overflowed and already spilled beyond China. The same story goes for construction. Well, skyscrapers. The Chinese adore them. In the last 30 years, they've built as many as the entire America did in the whole 20th century. And if you look at the top 10 tallest buildings in the world today, half of them will be Chinese. And if you take a look at the list of the top 50 cities in the world with the tallest buildings, again, half of them are Chinese. Well, it's understandable that throughout the history of humanity, all we do is measure the length of our possibilities. So, as soon as these possibilities arise, we immediately want to show them off to the max, so that it's visible. That's why every Chinese megacity has its own record breaker. Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Tianjin, and of course, Beijing. But 7 years ago, the Chinese decided not to show not only how high they can go, but also how fast. In the city of Changsha, with 8 million people, they built a 57-story skyscraper in 90 days. For those who don't know, 10 years ago, they were building 30 stories in 15 days. The point is that for such construction, you don't even need concrete, just a steel frame. All the modules are made by robots in the factory. And on site, they are simply assembled like Lego blocks. And with these steel frames, China decided to build the tallest building in the world, 220 stories high, in just 90 days. Not counting the foundation preparation, it would be 210 days. Still pretty fast. Well, and here, suddenly in China, they decided to ban skyscrapers. Now you can't build anything higher than half a kilometer anywhere. In smaller cities, there will be a ban on buildings taller than 250 meters, and in some places even 100 meters. Why did they decide to cut everything like this in a country where the population is already 1.5 billion people? And it seems like there is no way without high-rise constructions. First of all, look at how this 291-meter glass and concrete structure in Shenzhen is shaking, and people are running as far away from the skyscraper as possible. It turns out that the race to who can build faster and higher led to safety issues. Secondly, think about it. All these 40 years of continuous development in China, hundreds of millions of affluent citizens have emerged who want to live in convenient, green cities rather than in stone and glass concrete jungles. It's no longer the situation where the majority from poor villages just moves to the city in search of a better life and agrees to everything. Now there is money, their own technologies, and they need to be applied somewhere. And the example of Africa, returning to it, shows that China's economic influence will transform into political influence. Poor countries, to avoid losing to their neighbors, will need technologies, infrastructure, it will need to be built, and that's where China comes in with its speed, cost-effectiveness, and loans. But whoever dares to get involved in this may become the new Kenya, Sri Lanka or Ecuador. Why Ecuador? A few years ago, the Chinese promptly built a hydroelectric power station there. But after some time, dangerous cracks appeared downstream. There were constant floods for the peasants. And the credit of $1 billion and $7 million means Ecuador has to pay $125 million in interest alone every year. Other massive loans have brought the country to the point where they hand over 80% of all the oil they extract to Chinese companies. And now, friends, Chinese wisdom, where all those figures of massive profits from Africa come from. China invested $300 billion in African construction. However, most of the factories, roads, railways, ports and dams built with Chinese money remain in Chinese ownership due to the debts. Millions of Chinese workers are employed there, but all these assets are maintained by local budgets. And if the local work is for meager wages, Chinese expansion abroad will only gain momentum because resources within the country are already tight. 65% of the population lives in cities. Approximately the same was in the Soviet Union in the 18th. China invests in technology and infrastructure with the country, but at the same time cleverly manipulates weaker countries beyond its borders. So, be strong and invest in yourself and your future.